So you found the skeleton. How would you tell people that it's you personally? How would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur, and welcome back for another episode of Genesis Apologetics Should Apologize. This time we get to hear the two knuckleheads talk about adaptation and natural selection. I'm not sure what they're going to say in this one, since creationists are usually less wrong than normal about these, although they're still far from accurate. Well, get yourself a snack, a beverage, and a Dapper On-Set brand pillow for face protection, and let's dive back into this bottomless pit of stupid once again.
Is it just me, or has the evolution from one kind of animal into another never been seen?
Well, unless you're about to give an objective way to tell what a kind is, one which can be confirmed or falsified using objective data, then I'm going to say that no one has seen a change from one kind of animal to another for the same reason that no one has seen the change from one animal Cefeltidad to another animal Cefeltidad, because there's just no such thing as a Cefeltidad. Alternatively, we could just say that a kind is a clade that is not part of any larger clade, but then, by definition, life would never leave its ancestral clades, and so we couldn't see anything leave its kind, and evolution would say that there is only one kind on Earth. Life kind.
So Darwin's finches left South America, traveled to the Galapagos Islands, and over time, each island developed its own species. But is that really evolution?
Well, I wouldn't say that each island developed its own finches, rather the finches diverged to adapt to their different environments. The islands are a bunch of rock and dirt. They're not doing much of anything beyond existing. But yes, this is evolution, because biological evolution is at a minimum any change in allele frequency in a population. Alleles being variations for a gene. For example, humans have two common alleles for earwax consistency, dry and wet. If the proportion of dry versus wet earwax alleles were to vary across time in the human population, that would be evolution. It's not much evolution, but it's evolution.
Your smartphone is pretty amazing, but it can only do things it's programmed to do. Hey, that's it! That's the difference!
What's the difference?
I've been reading through a textbook, and they keep giving great examples of how creatures change, like Darwin's finches, or these tortoises. But this isn't evolution by natural forces.
I suppose it's evolution by supernatural forces? Are there ghosts on the Galapagos Islands changing the flora and fauna there?
If these animals were programmed to adapt like that.
What do you mean programmed? Programmed behaviors are entirely predictable if you know the status of all inputs. So can you predict the method of adaptation of animals to new environments? Where is this predetermined adaptation to be found? Because I'll tell you right now, it's not already in the genome of existing animals except in the slightest degree. The ancestors of those tortoises did not have the alleles or even genes to take on their present form in their genomes.
I see what you're saying. Many evolutionists consider any change as evolution, which makes it seem like we're always evolving upward, but...
No, only changes in the genome are evolutionary. Many organisms can make minor changes to their bodies to respond to environmental stress without there being an underlying change in the genotype. For example, dogs shed more when it's hot, plants grow more slowly when it's dry, and tardigrades can desiccate themselves and shrink when there is not enough water or food for them. None of this is evolution, but it's all change. Further, the theory of biological evolution makes no value judgment on the changes it describes. I know that the Great Chain of Being is still a sort of background feature of Western culture, and has been ever since Plato and Aristotle, right through into medieval Christianity, which adopted it and shoved a Christian theology into it. But the theory of evolution has no place for ranking organisms as higher or lower. It's true that older works, including Darwin's Origin of the Species, use terms like higher forms, but that's not current science.
Not all changes come from accidental errors through mutation. Some pre-programmed variation helps animals adapt through genetic recombining.
And how did those variations get there? Let's just assume that the Noah's Ark story is true as accepted by young Earth creationists, even though it obviously isn't, and it's right up there with flat Earth and vaccines causing autism in terms of sheer wrongness. So we have, according to most creationists, two wolves or wolf-like animals. And now we're just going to focus on modern wolves, which descended from them. And just on their mitochondrial DNA. Because all of these wolves descended from a single she-wolf that got off the ark, they all have her as their mitochondrial Eve, which means every single allele in mitochondria in wolves is the result of a mutation. But wolves are divided into 9 mitochondrial haplogroups, each of which is subdivided into dozens of subgroups, all of which have their own internal variety. So we know for a fact that even just looking at mitochondrial DNA, all of this variation had to result from mutation, even if the flood happened, which it didn't. But it gets worse. We could only have at most 4 alleles for any locus on the nuclear DNA in the founding pair of wolves off the Ark. But wolves have a large diversity in their nuclear DNA too, and if we accept what most young Earth creationists say, and say that all modern canines are descended from this Noah's Ark pair of canines, then we have to include all the diversity of modern canines, and clearly we run into the problem that there are orders of magnitude too much genetic variation for it to have been primordial to the ancestral pair. The vast majority of canine genetic diversity must be the result of mutations, whether evolution or young Earth creationism is true.
Now, look at this. Our book lists the sources of genetic variation. This page lists the 2 main sources of change as mutation and genetic recombination.
Recombination isn't really a source of new diversity in terms of new genes or new alleles for old genes, but it can cause existing genetics to get shuffled into new combinations, which can result in new phenotypes. So while the source for this variation is still mutations, I'm more or less okay with calling recombination a source of variation, as long as we recognize it is dependent on mutation.
So mutations would be accidents, errors?
Right. Mutations are usually caused when there's an error copying a creature's genetic information, which is found in its DNA. It can lose, duplicate, or even copy letters in the genetic code.
But if I delete, scramble, or duplicate letters, won't I eventually get a new word?
Oh great. Now we're about to get a disanalogy between human language and DNA. DNA being far less specific than human language. Never mind the fact that de novo gene creation has been observed by humans, but to be fair, that's just my prediction. Let's see where they actually go with this.
Sure, but a new word doesn't necessarily mean anything.
So if I scramble the letters in puppy, it just means gibberish?
Exactly. Mutations might be able to create a new combination of letters, but it needs to have a meaning for the cell to use as a blueprint later on.
Time for a bit of genetics 101. DNA is composed of a sugar phosphate backbone running on either side of the molecule, between which are base pairs composed of nitrogen phosphate groups. Each base pair can come in one of 4 types: adenine, A, thymine, T, guanine, G, or cytosine, C. Adenine and thymine are always opposite to each other, and guanine and cytosine are also always opposite to each other in a base pair. These sequences are grouped into sections of 3, each section being called a codon. This means there are 64 codons, and each codon has a particular assignment, coding to either start or stop transcription, or coding for one of the 20 amino acids that all life on Earth uses to make proteins. So any sequence of codons that has a start, some protein coding codons, and a stop can form a protein. In this way, the genetic code is extremely robust, and while proteins may end up malformed due to genetic mutations, they are still generally transcribable, and even, quote, malformed proteins can end up being useful in certain environments, especially when the protein is coded for by duplicate genes, only one of which mutates, leaving the organism with the original protein as well as a new, already complex protein which can now evolve a new function which may well involve the protein becoming more or less complex than the original one. So while the English language is not very robust and quickly becomes meaningless in written form with scrambled letters, the same simply isn't true for DNA. That's not to say that the genetic code is simple, it is far from it, but simplicity and robustness are not the same.
In other words, a code isn't really a code without some assigned meaning.
Well, I do use the phrase genetic code, but I will say that this is only by way of analogy. But even so, all codons have a meaning. There is no sequence of 3 base pairs which doesn't mean something. Granted, genes can still break such that there is not a functioning start or stop codon in the region they are contained in, and so they don't get transcribed. But it also happens that such regions can mutate to gain start and stop coda, allowing them to be transcribed into new proteins. So John here is just pushing the disanalogy between genetics and human language even further.
Gibberish can't create anything.
So mutations are always bad?
Yeah.
No.
There are so many documented beneficial mutations, I'm not even going to list them. But really, all I need to show that some of them can be beneficial is a quick definition and an example. A beneficial mutation is any mutation in an organism that provides a reproductive advantage compared to other members of the organism's species in a given environment. So what might be beneficial in some circumstances may well be harmful in others. Whether a mutation is beneficial is always context dependent. But that being said, there are 3 beneficial mutations in humans I'd like to look at. The first 2 are pale skin in humans in cold environments. You might think that this is only a single mutation, but in fact pale skin in East Asia and parts of native populations in North America, and pale skin in Europe have different genetic bases. These mutations allow people in areas with low ultraviolet light to produce more vitamin D, which is a survival advantage in those areas. It also leaves them more prone to sunburn and skin cancer in areas with more UV light, and so would be a harmful mutation in such areas. The other mutation is lactose tolerance, which has the obvious advantage of allowing a new source of calorie-rich food to be consumed. But this would be harmful in areas without access to dairy since it makes weaning of children more difficult, which is why lactose intolerance is the default condition for all adult mammals. We know that these are mutations because of both their distribution in various particular populations of humans, as well as being able to sequence DNA from ancient humans to see what their genetics were like.
Look at what it says. Some mutations, such as those that cause genetic diseases, may be lethal. Other mutations may lower fitness by decreasing an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. Still, other mutations may improve an individual's ability to survive and reproduce.
It looks like they agree that mutations are bad, but then why do they say some may improve an individual?
No, they didn't agree that mutations are just bad in total. You just read the section where they said some can help. If they agreed that mutations were bad, that wouldn't be in there, and since we have already seen beneficial mutations, we know for a fact not all of them are harmful.
They give you an example right here. Over the past 20 years, mutations in the mosquito genome have made many African mosquitoes resistant to the chemical pesticides once used to control them.
Yeah, another example of a beneficial mutation. Thanks for doing my job, I guess.
Okay, so it looks like the mosquitoes are better off because of mutation.
Yes, but what they don't tell you is that resistance actually came from a loss of information in the mosquito's genetic code.
Information, a word that rivals only the word kind in terms of how infrequently it's ever given a useful definition by creationists. Creationists treat information as if it were some non-physical entity that exists in an ideal form in some spiritual realm, or something that any change in which represents a deviation from its platonic ideal and therefore a reduction in information. Back in reality, though, the only way to use information theory to measure the information in the genetic code is to simply assign each base pair a value 1 through 4, which means every base pair is 2 bits of information, and the amount of information is the number of base pairs in the genome times 2 bits. So only deletion mutations actually lower the amount of information in the DNA.
The mosquito's ability to control its enzyme production is now messed up, and one of the strange side effects of too many enzymes is increased pesticide resistance.
I'm just going to assume that you're right, but you haven't shown how that's a loss of information. And yeah, that sounds like in the absence of those pesticides, that'd be a bad deal for the mosquitoes. But like I said, all mutations are only beneficial contextually. Organisms have to interact with the environment in which they find themselves, not some hypothetical ideal world. If mosquitoes are being sprayed with insecticides, then that's their environment, no matter what would be good for the mosquitoes or how their environment was before the spraying.
However, normal mosquitoes without the disease are much healthier in the wild where there is no pesticide.
Yeah, mosquitoes in a different environment are subject to different selection pressures. I feel like that's a pretty basic part of evolution. I'm not sure why you think that this aspect of the theory of evolution is a problem for the theory of evolution.
So it was a loss of information, but it was a benefit for those mosquitoes, right?
No, it's not right until you can define information in a useful way that lets us take an objective measure of it so we can compare any 2 genomes and tell which has more information, and by how much.
Well, they only benefit by being more resistant to the pesticide.
And since they live in an environment full of pesticides, that's a benefit. You don't get to say, oh, they only benefit because of their environment, so it's not a real benefit. The harm or benefit of mutations is dependent on the current environment.
The point is, by losing information, they lost control of an enzyme's production. Now, evolution needs to explain gains of information over time. And the same goes for other examples they give, like bacteria becoming more resistant, bone density, humans becoming more resistant to HIV.
How do you know any of these things resulted from a loss of information? There's no way you've given or even referenced in order to tell us how to measure such a thing. You might as well have said that all these mutations left the organism with less gorballectionization. It's just meaningless unless you can objectively quantify it, tell us how you did it, and then we can go and do the same thing and get the same results you do. So far, that hasn't ever happened.
But if a population of creatures continues to lose information, could it be deadly for them?
Bingo! But here's the real problem.
Is the real problem that that sentence doesn't mean anything because you can't lose an undefined thing that no one has ever bothered to even attempt to measure?
People count on that loss of information from mutations to create the genetic blueprint for every living creature on Earth out of nothing. That's crazy.
No way, that's so impossible. It destroys evolution.
Right?
You're wrong.
You're so wrong.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong.
Exactly. It's not right. And I guess that's not the problem, but what you say the problem is means nothing. You have literally not made an argument because you neglected to define your terms. This is why when I asked Standing for Truth to debate whether mutations can cause an increase in information, he declined and instead offered to debate on evolution. The only way we have of defining information measurably means that any mutation that results in more base pairs in a piece of DNA is an increase in information. But clearly, that's not what creationists mean. But what they really mean is that they're going to use some undefined kind of information, because they can say nothing, but have it sound intuitively bad, and thereby trick people into thinking there is some problem for evolution here.
Okay, so what about the other changes? Program change, or you called it genetic recombination.
Look at what it says here. Most heritable differences are due not to mutations, but to genetic recombination. So, God not only created all the animals, he also packed them with enough genetic information that would allow them to adapt to different environments and varieties we see today.
But then, according to you, he killed off nearly all of them, leaving behind a vanishingly small amount of genetic diversity compared to what we see today, meaning that even if you're right, nearly all of modern genetic diversity in all organisms must be new diversity that has arisen through mutation in the time since your imagined flood.
So adaptation is real?
Yeah, I saw an explanation of it in the Focus on Earth Science. Individuals with characteristics that are poorly suited to the environment are less likely to survive and reproduce.
Over time, poorly suited characteristics may disappear from the species.
So a population of animals can adapt by expressing variety over time, but there are limits to how much they can change.
In what way?
Think about rolling dice. If you had 2 dice, you could roll anything between 2 and 12. The variety is programmed into the dice, but you can't roll anything higher or lower.
Yeah, selection works to drive down genetic diversity in a manner that leaves the resulting population with less diversity if taken on its own. But as we've already seen, mutations work to increase diversity, a fact that even your pseudo-historical beliefs require to be true, and that has been observed in the real world in actual organisms.
I get what you're saying. Likewise, animals can express a lot of variety, but there's a limit because of the finite genetic information they have.
Exactly.
There's a limit to what can be selected at any given time, but across time, mutations provide new material for selection to act on.
And while we've seen some pretty amazing varieties within the kinds God created, like in dogs, one basic kind of animal can never change into another.
Well, you've already shown more variation in dogs than can be accounted for based on the Noah's Ark story. Plus, you have never given anyone a way to objectively determine what a kind is. So, you coupled an image that proves you wrong with a statement that means nothing. Good job. I see now why so many politicians are creationists. They already have practice at saying things that sound reasonable, but don't actually mean anything.
And that fits with all the examples we see in these textbooks.
Although they like to point out the differences in finch beaks and tortoises.
It's just adaptation within the genetic limits of that kind.
Right.
Wrong, since there's no such thing as a kind. You're just using these observed instances of organisms obeying the evolutionary law of monophily, which states that an organism can never outgrow its ancestry, and pretending that this adherence to the laws of evolution is some kind of problem for evolution. In fact, if a tortoise were to become a meerkat, that would disprove the modern synthesis of evolution. Granted, it also wouldn't be a big win for biblical creationism if that happened.
but then they pass it off as evolution. And you know, I used to think that all these arguments really showed evolution, but then I got to thinking.
Let me guess. You got to thinking that you didn't actually know what evolution was, and that if you made up terms like kind and information, but never bothered to actually give them definitions that could be used to learn anything about the real world, it let you more easily accept that obviously not literally true stories were literally true, which made your theology more childishly simple. I mean, to be honest, that's the only way that this can lead someone to think that evolution isn't true.
Studying changes in a beak shape, like Darwin's finches, won't show you where that beak came from. And despite the minor changes, a finch is still just a finch.
Yeah, I think I was right here, and you're just being dishonest. But in fact, the same mechanism that created the variety in beak shape created the beak. In fact, we have a great series of fossils showing dinosaurs with and without beaks, and beaks of varying size, including aviolans, getting more and more prominent beaks and losing teeth. Well, after this they start reading from the Bible, so that's where I'll end this video. Stay tuned for the next one because John and Jane are far from done. Thanks for watching. But before you go, I'd like to take a few moments to thank my patrons, especially my $20 patrons, Bob Knob and Res Instance. All of my patrons are helping me produce these videos by helping me get better equipment and software. If you'd like to help, head over to my Patreon. I have tiers starting as low as $1 a month, and every bit helps. If a monthly donation isn't right for you, but you still want to help, please visit my merch store or my Amazon wishlist. All links are in the description. Even if you can't help monetarily, your reviews and comments help more than you know. So please, if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you always know when there's new Dapper Dino content. Again, thanks for watching. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.
You found the skeleton. How would you tell if it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide? Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.